That night started like 100 other family dinners. The kind where the table is a little too small, the plates don't quite match, and everyone pretends they're not tired. I had come home from work exhausted, already rehearsing in my head how I was going to get through the evening without arguing about my job, my plans, or the fact that I was still living at home at 26. My mom had made her usual pasta. My dad had his phone face down on the table like he was trying to be present. It felt normal, comfortable, even. We talked about small things at first. My mom complained about the neighbor's dog. My dad mentioned something about traffic. I nodded, smiled, passed the bread. The kind of polite, surface-level conversation families have when everyone's dancing around the real topics. I should have noticed the way they kept looking at each other, like they were waiting for a cue. I didn't. I was too busy trying to finish my food and get back to my room. Then my dad cleared his throat. That sound, just a small, ordinary sound, changed everything. He put his fork down and looked at me the way people look at someone when they're about to say something they've practiced. My mom folded her hands in front of her, suddenly very interested in the pattern on the tablecloth. And that's when he said it calmly, almost gently. "So, we've been talking. You can take the guest room or move out." At first, I honestly thought I misheard him. I even laughed a little because it sounded like a joke. "The guest room, move out." I asked, "What do you mean?" Even though my chest had already started to feel tight, like I knew exactly what he meant. My mom jumped in, her voice soft but firm. She said they needed their space. That I was too comfortable in my old room, that it was time for changes. The guest room, she explained, was temporary, a transition, or I could just move out. It wasn't the words that hurt the most. It was the way they said it. Like they were offering me two reasonable options, like this was some kind of polite negotiation instead of my life being pulled out from under me in the middle of dinner. I looked down at my plate. My appetite was gone. My face felt hot, but my hands were cold. I wanted to ask 100 questions. Why now? Why like this? Why during dinner? But all that came out was, "So, you're kicking me out of my room?" My dad sighed like I was being dramatic. "We're not kicking you out, we're giving you a choice." That word, choice. It echoed in my head, because it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like a deadline I didn't know was coming. The guest room was small, bare, it wasn't my space. It wasn't the room I grew up in, the room with memories stuck in the walls. And moving out, I wasn't financially ready. Not really. I had plans, but they were months away, not tonight. I sat there, staring at the people who raised me, realizing something had shifted. This wasn't just about rooms. This was about them deciding I had outgrown my place in their house. Or maybe that I had stayed too long. The table felt suddenly too big. Or maybe I felt too small. And in that moment, with everyone waiting for my answer, I realized this wasn't just a dinner conversation. It was the beginning of a line being drawn. After the shock of their ultimatum settled in, the silence at the table became unbearable. My fork sat untouched on my plate, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I finally asked the question that was burning in my chest. Why? It came out quieter than I expected, almost like I was afraid of the answer. My mom was the first to speak. She said they loved me, of course they did, but they felt like I was stuck. That word hit me harder than I thought it would. Stuck. Like I was a car in neutral, like I wasn't trying, like I was just taking up space. She explained that they wanted me to push myself, to take the next step, to stop being so comfortable at home. According to her, the guest room was supposed to be a wake-up call, a reminder that this wasn't my forever place anymore. My dad nodded along, then added his part. He said it wasn't healthy for any of us for me to stay in my childhood room, that I needed to feel a little pressure, that sometimes people only grow when they're uncomfortable. He said it in that calm, logical tone he uses when he thinks he's being fair, like he was explaining a business decision, not talking about his daughter's life. I sat there trying to process what they were really saying. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, encouraging, even, parents wanting their kid to be independent. Parents wanting their kid to grow up. But the more they talked, the more I realized this wasn't just about growth. It was about control, about their timeline, not mine. About who they thought I should be by now. They started listing things. I was still at the same job. I hadn't moved out yet. I hadn't figured everything out. They compared me, carefully, politely, to other people my age. Friends, kids who had their own apartments. Cousins who were already married. People who, in their eyes, were doing life the right way. Every sentence felt like a quiet accusation. Like I was failing some invisible test they had been grading for years. I wanted to scream that I was trying, that I was saving money, that I had plans. That life isn't a straight line and not everyone hits milestones on schedule. But the words got stuck in my throat, tangled up with something heavier. The realization that they didn't see my effort, only my delay. What hurt the most wasn't that they wanted me to move forward. It was that they chose pressure over support. They didn't ask me how I was doing. They didn't ask what I needed. They just decided the solution was to take away my sense of security and call it motivation. My mom said, "We're not trying to be cruel. We just don't want you getting too comfortable." Too comfortable. In my own home. In the room I grew up in. In the only place that still felt stable when everything else in my life felt uncertain. That's when it really hit me. This wasn't about space in the house. It wasn't about the guest room. It was about them being tired of waiting for me to become the version of myself they had imagined. And instead of walking with me while I figured things out, they decided to push me out of the nest and hope I'd learn to fly on the way down. I looked at them and realized something painful. Their reason made sense in their world, but in mine, it felt like abandonment dressed up as tough love. It felt like they were more invested in the idea of who I should be than in understanding who I actually was. And that's when I knew this conversation wasn't just about where I was going to sleep. It was about whether I was still welcome as I was, or only as who they wanted me to become. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house make its usual sounds. The quiet hum of the fridge, the soft creak of the floor when someone walked to the bathroom. The distant bark of a dog outside. Everything felt the same, but nothing was. My room, the one I'd had since I was a teenager, suddenly felt temporary, like I was already a guest in my own life. Sometime after midnight, I sat up and turned on the lamp. The light fell over the posters on my wall, the bookshelf I'd filled over the years, the little things I'd collected without ever thinking I'd have to pack them in a hurry. I opened my closet and just stood there for a while, staring. It's strange how fast a place can stop feeling like home once you realize you're not really wanted in it anymore. I kept hearing my dad's voice in my head, "You can take the guest room, or move out." The words felt heavier in the quiet of the night. The guest room wasn't really an option in my mind. It felt like agreeing to be slowly pushed out anyway, like accepting a smaller version of my life while pretending it was temporary. So if I was going to be displaced, I figured I might as well do it on my own terms. I started with a suitcase, then another bag. I told myself I was just organizing, but deep down, I knew I was packing to leave. Every item I picked up carried a memory. Old concert tickets tucked into a drawer. A hoodie I'd stolen from an ex and never gave back. A photo frame from high school graduation. I didn't realize how much of my life was stored in that room until I had to decide what was worth taking and what I could leave behind. It felt less like packing clothes and more like sorting through versions of myself. At some point, I sat on the floor and just cried. Not the quiet, polite kind of crying. The messy, chest-hurting kind. Because no one tells you that growing up sometimes feels like being evicted from your own past. No one tells you that leaving home isn't always about excitement and freedom. Sometimes it's about realizing you don't fit where you used to anymore. I kept thinking about how earlier that day, I'd walked into the house like normal. I'd dropped my bag in the same room. I'd assumed this space was still mine. And now, a few hours later, I was folding my life into boxes and bags like it had always been temporary. Around 3 a.m., I heard my mom's door open. She came down the hallway and stopped in my doorway. She didn't say much, just asked, "You're really doing this?" I nodded. She looked tired, maybe sad, maybe unsure, but she didn't stop me. That hurt more than I expected. By sunrise, my room looked empty. The walls were bare. The shelves were half cleared. The bed looked like it belonged to someone else. I stood there with my bags at my feet and realized something terrifying and empowering at the same time. I was actually leaving. I didn't have a perfect plan. I didn't have a dream apartment waiting. I had a friend's couch, some savings, and a lot of fear. But I also had something new, a sense that this wasn't just an ending. It was a line I was finally crossing. As I carried my bags to the door, my hands were shaking. Not because they were heavy, but because I knew that once I walked out, things wouldn't go back to the way they were. That night, I didn't just pack clothes, I packed my old life. And I stepped into a new one without knowing exactly where it would lead. If you had asked my parents that night what they thought I would do, I'm pretty sure they would have said I'd take the guest room. That I'd cool off. That I'd complain for a few days, maybe argue a little, but eventually settle into the smaller space and keep living the same half-in, half-out life I'd been living. I think, in their minds, the ultimatum was supposed to scare me into getting serious, while still keeping me under their roof, still within their rules. What they didn't expect was for me to actually leave. When I walked into the kitchen that morning with my bags, my dad looked genuinely confused. My mom looked like she'd been crying. For a second, I almost felt guilty. Almost. But then I remembered the way they'd said it so calmly the night before, like my life was just another household arrangement to reorganize. "I'm going," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they might hear it. "Where?" my mom asked. "I don't know, a friend's place for now." "I'll figure it out." They both started talking at once. My dad said I was being dramatic. My mom said I didn't have to rush, that the guest room was still an option, that they didn't mean for me to leave like this. And that's when it hit me. The ultimatum wasn't supposed to have consequences, not real ones. They wanted leverage, not distance. They wanted to pressure me, not lose control of the situation. Standing there with my bags, I realized something important. If I stayed, even in the guest room, nothing would really change. I'd still be the kid in their house, living on their terms, trying to prove I was doing enough to deserve my place there. Leaving was scary, but staying felt like slowly disappearing. So I said no. That word felt strange in my mouth. Powerful, final. "I need to do this," I told them. "If I stay, I'm just going to keep living your version of my life. I need to try living mine." My dad shook his head like I was making a huge mistake. My mom cried, and for a moment I almost broke. I almost dropped my bags and said, "Fine, I'll take the guest room, let's pretend this never happened." But something in me had already shifted. The line had already been crossed. They didn't expect me to choose uncertainty over comfort. They didn't expect me to choose fear over familiarity. They didn't expect me to walk away from the house I grew up in because staying suddenly felt like giving up on myself. When I stepped outside, the air felt different. Too bright, too open. My car felt too small for everything I was carrying, emotionally and physically. As I drove away, my hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was adrenaline. It was the realization that I had just made a decision that would change my life, whether it turned out great or terrible. I didn't have a perfect plan. I didn't have a safety net that felt solid. I had a friend's couch, a few boxes, and a lot of "I'll figure it out." But I also had something I hadn't had in a long time: ownership of my own choices. My parents thought the ultimatum would push me forward while keeping me close. Instead, it pushed me out into the world. And even though it was terrifying, it was also the first time I felt like my life was actually mine. They expected compliance. They got independence. And that changed everything. Moving out didn't just change where I slept at night. It changed everything about how my parents and I related to each other. The first few weeks were awkward, quiet, and emotionally exhausting. I went from seeing them every day to barely hearing from them at all. At first, that silence hurt more than I expected. Even after everything, they were still my parents. A part of me kept waiting for a call, a text, some sign that they regretted how things had gone and wanted to fix it. But instead, what came was distance. Not angry distance, not dramatic distance, just space. And in that space, I started to realize something. This was the first time in my life I wasn't living under their rules, their expectations, or their constant judgment of whether I was doing enough. It was terrifying and strangely peaceful at the same time. Living on a friend's couch wasn't glamorous. I had to be careful with money. I had to plan everything. I had to ask myself real, adult questions like, can I afford this? And what's my next move? There were nights I lay awake wondering if I'd made a huge mistake. If I should have just taken the guest room and kept things easy. Comfort has a way of calling you back when life gets hard. But every time I thought about going back, I remembered that dinner table. That ultimatum, that feeling of being reduced to a problem to solve instead of a person to support. Slowly, my parents and I started talking again, not like before. There were no more casual drop-ins or assumed family dinners. Every visit had to be planned. Every conversation felt more careful, more adult. And that's when the new rules started to form, even if no one said them out loud. Rule 1. My life choices were no longer up for daily debate. Rule 2. Their house was no longer my default safety net. Rule 3. Respect had to go both ways or the conversation didn't happen. At first, they didn't like that. My dad still tried to give advice that sounded a lot like orders. My mom still worried out loud about my timeline, my plans, my future. But something was different now. I wasn't hearing those things from a bedroom down the hall. I was hearing them as a guest. As an adult who could leave whenever the conversation crossed a line. And sometimes I did. That was new. And powerful. Over time, something unexpected happened. The space that hurt at first started to heal us. They began to see me less as a kid who hadn't launched, yet and more as a person actually trying to build something on her own. I started to see them less as judges and more as flawed humans who didn't always know how to handle their fear of me struggling. We didn't magically become a perfect family. Some conversations are still tense, some topics are still landmines, but the dynamic changed, the control shifted, the expectations became negotiable, and the biggest change. I stopped feeling like I had to earn my place in my own life. Moving out forced me to grow up fast. I learned how to budget, how to ask for help, how to fail a little and keep going. I learned that independence isn't about having everything figured out. It's about trusting yourself to handle things when you don't. The ultimatum they gave me didn't break our relationship. It rewrote it, on new terms, with new boundaries, and with a version of me who finally understood that sometimes the hardest door to walk through is the one that leads to your own life. And sometimes, that's exactly the door you need to choose. If you've ever been put in a position where you had to choose between comfort and your own growth, I want to hear your story. What did you choose, and how did it change your life? Drop your experience in the comments so others who are struggling don't feel alone. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real, emotional stories about family, boundaries, and finding your own path. Remember, sometimes the hardest step away from home is the first step toward becoming who you're meant to be.